October of 1961. A sporting goods counter in Massachusetts. A new American carbine is laid on the glass. Walnut stock, blued steel, tubular magazine. A short, handy rifle a man could carry one-handed across a creek. The cartridge stamped on the barrel is the most powerful handgun cartridge ever produced in the United States. The man behind the counter says it again, slower because the hunter does not believe him. This is a rifle. It fires the .44 Magnum. The company that invented the .44 Magnum is Smith Wesson. They have been building handguns in Springfield, Massachusetts since 1852. They are the largest revolver maker in America. They have not built a rifle for the cartridge they invented. A different company has. A company that does not build revolvers as well as Smith Wesson does. A company whose name is on a card table sign at gun shows. A company run by a man who saw what S&W did not. Or did Bill Ruger just guess right twice in 5 years and convince a generation of American hunters to mistake a hardware store carbine for an heirloom rifle? The .44 Magnum carbine was the third object on the glass that morning. There were two others. The first was a Smith & Wesson Model 29, 6-inch barrel, polished blue. The revolver that had been on the cover of every gun magazine in America for the previous 6 years. The most beautiful handgun anyone at the counter had ever held. It cost $140. The hunter had been saving for it for 2 years. The second object on the glass was a Ruger Blackhawk in .44 Magnum. Same cartridge, different rifle. Single-action revolver, the kind the cowboys carried, with a long barrel and a flat hammer. The Ruger cost $87, almost half the price of the Smith. The man behind the counter did not push it. He did not have to. The hunter had already noticed the price. The third object was the carbine. The Ruger .44 Magnum carbine. Lever rifle in shape only. Semi-automatic in mechanism. Walnut stock. 18-inch barrel. The same cartridge as the two revolvers next to it, throwing the same bullet at 500 feet per second faster out of a longer barrel. $85. A handgun. A second handgun. And a rifle that fired the handgun cartridge for less money than the handgun. The hunter looked at the three objects for a long time. The man whose name was on the carbine had been in the firearms business for 12 years and had never built a bolt-action rifle. William Batterman Ruger was born in Brooklyn in 1916. His father was a lawyer. He shot a .22 at 12. In his early 20s, in a garage in North Carolina, he built a working light machine gun from photographs of a Maxim. He took it to the Army. The Army was not interested. He went to work at Springfield Armory during the Second World War, the federal armory that had been making American military rifles since 1794. He saw the lathes. He saw the forges. He saw the apprenticeships that took 5 years to complete. He saw what an old American manufacturing institution looked like at full capacity. He also saw what it cost. When the war ended, he tried to start a rifle company. It failed. Within 2 years, he was broke. In 1949, in a barn in Southport, Connecticut, he started over. He had a partner named Alex Sturm, 26 years old, family money behind him. Their first product was a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol that looked like a German Luger. Stamped steel receiver. $37.50. They sold every one. Sturm died of viral hepatitis in 1951, 28 years old. Ruger kept his name on the company for the rest of his life. The pattern Ruger had figured out by the early 50s was a pattern nobody else in the American gun industry had figured out. He built guns that looked old and were made new. The single six in 1953. A single-action revolver that looked like 1873 and ran on coil springs. The Blackhawk in 1955, same idea, scaled up for centerfire cartridges. Both rifles outsold the established competitors who had been making revolvers in the United States for 100 years. Ruger was not building for the men who already owned a Colt. He was building for the men who had wanted a Colt and could not pay for one. The market the established gun makers had been ignoring. In 1955, while Ruger was still selling the new Blackhawk by the case, a man named Elmer Keith walked into Smith & Wesson's office in Springfield, Massachusetts, with a cartridge proposal. What happened in that office and what S&W did not do afterward gave Bill Ruger his next rifle. To understand the carbine, you have to understand the cartridge it fired and where the cartridge came from. The .44 Magnum was the work of three men. Elmer Keith was a Montana cattleman and the gun writer for Guns and Ammo. Through the late 1940s and early 1950s, Keith had been hand-loading the .44 Special, a moderate handgun cartridge from 1907, to pressures the cartridge had never been designed for. He was using heavier bullets at higher velocities than any factory load. He believed the result was the handgun cartridge American hunters actually needed for deer and bear at close range. He published his loads. He shot animals with them. He wrote about it for a decade. In 1955, Smith and Wesson and Remington took Keith's ideas seriously. They sat down with him. They lengthened the .44 Special case by 1/8 of an inch, just enough to keep the new high-pressure cartridge from being chambered in old guns and blowing them apart. They standardized the load. They named it the .44 Remington Magnum. Smith and Wesson built the revolver for it, the Model 29, 6.5-inch barrel, heavy frame, the most powerful production handgun in the world, released in January of 1956. 6 weeks later, Bill Ruger released his own, the Blackhawk and .44 Magnum. The race that everyone in the industry had assumed would be between the two revolver companies was decided in a year. Smith and Wesson made better revolvers, but they made fewer of them. The Model 29 cost more, took longer to build, and shipped slower. Ruger had built his Blackhawk for the foundry from the first wax model, the same trick he would use 13 years later with the M77. And he was producing Blackhawks at 4 times the rate Smith & Wesson was producing Model 29s. By 1957, every man in America who had wanted a .44 Magnum revolver and could not get a Model 29 had a Blackhawk in his holster. That was the revolver story. The rifle story had not started yet. The .44 Magnum cartridge was, in handgun form, a powerful round. Out of a 6-inch barrel, the standard 240-grain factory load left the muzzle at about 1/350 feet per second. Hard-hitting at handgun ranges. Useful on deer at 50 yards, but the cartridge was wasted in a handgun. The .44 Magnum was loaded with a slow-burning powder that needed barrel length to finish burning. A 6-inch barrel left half the powder still burning when the bullet exited the muzzle, throwing flame and pressure into the air instead of into the bullet. A longer barrel, the engineers knew, would extract more velocity from the same cartridge, much more than the small gain a longer barrel usually produced. The .44 Magnum was a rifle cartridge in handgun clothing. The math was straightforward. An 18-inch barrel pushed the same 240-grain bullet to roughly 1,550 feet per second, 400 feet per second faster, 2/3 more energy on impact. A handgun cartridge that became a credible deer cartridge at 100 yards. Smith and Wesson knew this. The engineers at Marlin and Winchester knew this. Every gun writer in America knew this. None of them built the rifle. Smith & Wesson did not build a rifle for the cartridge they had invented because Smith & Wesson did not build rifles. The company had been a handgun maker for a century and was not going to pivot in 5 years. Marlin had a lever-action carbine, the Model 1894, that could have been chambered for the .44 Magnum easily, but Marlin in 1956 was focused on rimfire production and made no move. Winchester was Winchester, committed to the .30-30 in the lever-action market and not interested in chambering a handgun cartridge. The cartridge sat there for 5 years, building velocity nobody could use. Bill Ruger built the rifle. The Ruger .44 Magnum carbine, released in 1961, was the only American semi-automatic rifle ever produced for a handgun cartridge, until that point. It was a short, light carbine, 5.5 pounds, 18-inch barrel, 4-round tubular magazine. The action was gas-operated, a small piston driven by gases tapped from a port near the muzzle. The bolt cycled. The rifle reloaded itself. The carbine was the first semi-automatic rifle Ruger had ever built. The mechanism was new. The market was new. The cartridge was somebody else's. $85 at the gun counter. Less than the revolver that fired the same cartridge. The men in the gun magazines did not know what to make of it. A semi-automatic rifle for a handgun cartridge was not a category that existed in 1961. The traditional gun writers had no shelf to put it on. The men at the gun counters had a vocabulary for what they thought of it, and most of it was dismissive. Plinker, brush gun, trail rifle, camp gun. The kind of word a man used for a rifle he would not take to elk camp. A serious deer rifle, the men said, fired a serious cartridge. A 30-06, a 270, a 308, not a handgun round. A serious hunter, the men said, did not need a semi-automatic. A bolt action was enough. A semi-automatic was for a man who could not place his first shot. A semi-automatic was a Saturday afternoon rifle. Maybe your father said something like that. Maybe the man behind the counter at the sporting goods store said it the day you walked in to look at the new Ruger Carbine and walked out with a Marlin lever gun in 30-30 instead. The traditional gun writers had been trained to look at rifles in categories. Handguns were one category, lever-action rifles were another, bolt-action rifles were another. Semi-automatic rifles, when they existed at all, were military surplus or .22 plinkers. The Ruger 44 Carbine fit no category. It was a semi-automatic that fired a handgun cartridge that had been invented for a revolver. It belonged on no shelf in the magazines. What the writers were slow to say, the men in the woods said with their wallets. Hunters in the Northeast and the upper Midwest started carrying the carbine in dense timber. Whitetail country. 100-yard shots and under. The carbine was light, it was short. It cycled fast for a follow-up. The cartridge it fired hit a deer with more energy at 50 yards than a 30-30 had at the same distance. Guides in the Adirondacks bought them. Camp owners in Pennsylvania bought them. Bear hunters in Maine bought them. One by one, the loudest voices stopped saying the carbine was a plinker and started not saying anything about the carbine at all. By 1965, the Ruger 44 Carbine was the only semi-automatic deer rifle in the country worth talking about. It was on the rack of every sporting goods store from Bangor to Duluth. Field and Stream began running articles about it. Outdoor Life, where Jack O'Connor still wrote about flat-shooting rifles for Western country, gave it a careful, neutral review. Maybe your father carried one. Maybe there is one in a soft case in your closet right now, and you have never thought about why a handgun cartridge ended up in a rifle. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the subscribe button is right there. We are back at the rack. The mid-60s. By 1968, the carbine had been in continuous production for 7 years. Smith Wesson had built no rifle for the cartridge. Marlin, in 1969, finally chambered the model 1894 lever action for 44 Magnum. 8 years after Ruger had built the carbine, 13 years after the cartridge had been released, Winchester chambered the Model 94 for 44 Magnum in the same window. Both companies were responding to the market Bill Ruger had built. The 44 Magnum carbine market existed because Ruger had created it. Smith & Wesson, the company that owned the cartridge, had spent the same decade selling revolvers. By the early 70s, the Ruger 44 Carbine was a fixture of American deer hunting culture in the eastern timber. By the late 70s, used carbines were selling for more than the original list price. By the 80s, the carbine had become the rifle a father handed his son when the son was old enough for centerfire. Production ran from 1961 to 1985. Almost 250,000 carbines made. The cartridge that Smith & Wesson had invented and abandoned. The rifle Bill Ruger had built and kept building. There is something underneath this story that has nothing to do with rifles. It is the question of what a company owes the cartridge it invents. It is a question America was being asked in the 1950s and 60s about every kind of work a company could do. The patent, the design, the market that came with it. 2 answers got given in the American firearms industry in the years after 1956. Smith & Wesson gave the first answer. Build the gun the cartridge was named for. Build it well, sell it, move on. Smith & Wesson had built the Model 29. They had done it beautifully. They had spent the next decade refining the Model 29 and building other revolvers that fired the same cartridge. They had not, in any year of that decade, built a rifle for the .44 Magnum. The rifle market was somebody else's market. This is the answer of the company that knows what it is. The Ruger carbine was the second answer. The cartridge does not belong to the company that named it. The cartridge belongs to whatever rifle the cartridge fits inside. If Smith & Wesson will not build the rifle gets built by whoever sees the gap. This is the answer of the company that does not yet know what it is and is willing to find out. Two different bets about the same problem. Smith & Wesson bet that staying in their lane would protect the brand. Ruger bet that the cartridge market belonged to the man who built the rifle, regardless of whose name was on the cartridge. Smith & Wesson was not wrong. They are still the largest revolver maker in America. The Model 29 is still in production. But the rifle market for the .44 Magnum belongs to Bill Ruger. There is a man somewhere right now who owns both. A Smith & Wesson Model 29 he saved for in 1971. A Ruger carbine he bought used at a gun show in 1979. He shoots the carbine. He keeps the Model 29 in the safe. The Model 29 is the handgun his father wanted and could afford only later. The carbine is the rifle his father carried when he could not afford the handgun. What Bill Ruger understood that Smith & Wesson did not was that the man who could afford the cartridge could not always afford the company that named it. By every measure that fit on a spreadsheet by 1985, the Ruger .44 carbine had won. It had been in production for 24 years. Almost 250,000 had been built. It had outlived the era it was designed for. It had created the deer rifle category Smith & Wesson should have created and did not. That was the apparent ending. The carbine won. The handgun company stayed in its lane. The story closes. Except Ruger discontinued the carbine in 1985. Not because it had stopped selling, because the cartridge it fired had stopped being the .44 Magnum that Elmer Keith had asked Smith & Wesson to build. Through the 70s and 80s, factory loads of .44 Magnum had been quietly derated by the American ammunition makers. Federal pressure was lower. Velocities were lower. The cartridge that left the muzzle of a 1985 .44 Magnum carbine was not the cartridge that had left the muzzle of a 1961 .44 Magnum carbine. The hunters who had bought the carbine for the cartridge it had been built for were now firing a tamer round. Half the velocity Bill Ruger had calculated his rifle around had been quietly given back. Ruger did not call it a recall. Ruger did not announce that the cartridge had changed under him. He simply stopped building the rifle. 25 years later, Ruger released the .44 Magnum carbine again, redesigned in 2003. By that time, the original Model 44 carbine, the one that had made Bill Ruger's name in the rifle business before the M77, was selling on the used market for 3 times its original list price. Bill Ruger died in 2002. He never saw the carbine come back. The argument about whether a handgun cartridge belongs in a rifle is not over. There is a man at a gun counter somewhere this week telling another man that a .44 Magnum is a handgun round and a serious deer rifle takes a real cartridge. He is not wrong about what serious deer rifles take. He is wrong about whether the .44 Magnum was ever really a handgun round. If you have a Ruger .44 carbine in your safe right now, take it out. Look at the receiver. Look at the tubular magazine. Look at the short barrel that was supposed to be too short for a real cartridge. You are holding the rifle of the man who looked at the cartridge Smith & Wesson built for itself and decided that a cartridge does not belong to the company that named it. The cartridge belongs to whatever rifle the cartridge fits inside. He built the rifle Smith & Wesson did not. He built it for less than the revolver. He built it for 24 years. Maybe it was your father's rifle before it was yours. Maybe you bought it at a gun show in 1979. Maybe it is going to your son. If you have a Ruger .44 carbine, drop it in the comments. Which year, whose it was before it was yours? The story of that rifle in your family is part of this story too, and if this is the kind of channel you want more of, slow, factual, cinematic, the subscribe button is right there. There is more of this canon coming. The pre-64 Model 70 has its own video. The Walker trigger has its own video. The M77, the bolt-action Bill Ruger built 7 years after the carbine, in a foundry in New Hampshire, out of parts that came out of a ceramic shell, Is the next one being written?